The knock wasn't really a knock. It was softer, desperate, like something dying against the door. Caleb Morton reached for the rifle before he was fully awake.
Please, we
The
beg you.
desert wind howled through the gaps in the
Have
cabin
mercy.
walls, carrying sand, whispers, and something else, a sound that didn't belong to the night. He rose from the cot, boots scraping the floorboards, heart drumming low and slow. Another thud, then silence. He pulled the door open. 5 figures collapsed at his feet, 5 women, their faces blistered by sun and dust, their lips cracked and bleeding. Bare feet cut open from miles of stone. One of them tall, dark hair matted with blood, forced herself to her knees. Her voice was nothing more than air. "Don't let us die of thirst," she whispered. Her eyes lifted to his, hollow and fierce. "We walked through hell to find you." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rifle hung heavy in his hands, his finger resting near the trigger. He'd seen ambushes before, women used as bait, bandits waiting in the dark. But these weren't bait. These were ghosts who hadn't finished dying. "Who sent you?" he asked, voice rough. No answer. Only the rasp of breathing, the soft sound of someone trying not to cry. One of the younger girls, couldn't be more than 16, coughed so hard she fell forward into the dirt. Caleb stared down at her shaking shoulders. There was blood on her back, dried, days old. He cursed under his breath and lowered the rifle. "Get inside," he said, motioning with his chin. No one moved. They just stared at him, too weak, too afraid, too far gone to believe. So he stepped forward, hooked an arm under the eldest woman's shoulder, and dragged her toward the door. The others followed like shadows, stumbling, clutching one another. The heat of the room hit them, stale, smoky, but still warmer than death. Caleb set the woman by the fire and filled a tin cup from the water barrel. She reached for it with both hands, spilling half down her chin. The others waited in silence, watching every drop that left the cup. "Easy," he muttered. "There's more." He poured water for each of them, 1 cup at a time, until the barrel was almost empty. They drank without a sound. Even their tears were dry. When it was done, the eldest looked up again. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. "My name is Nayeli," she said. "These are my sisters." She hesitated, then added softly, "We have nowhere else." Caleb stood there, hands clenched, unsure whether to feel anger or pity. Outside, the wind roared against the door, like the desert demanding its dead back. He wanted to send them away. He wanted his silence, his empty nights, his safe, predictable loneliness. But when one of them, the youngest, reached toward the dying fire and whispered, "Please, don't make us leave," something in him cracked. He turned away before they could see it. "Rest," he said gruffly. "Tomorrow we'll see what's left of you." Then he doused the lantern and sat in the dark, rifle across his knees, listening to 5 strangers breathe, and wondering, for the first time in years, what kind of man he had just chosen to be. Morning came without light, only a dull gray that bled through the cracks in the cabin walls. Caleb hadn't slept. He sat by the stove, rifle across his lap, watching the 5 women breathe like survivors of a shipwreck. The fire had burned low. Ash clung to their hair, to the floor, to the edges of his boots. One of them, the youngest, stirred first, blinking into the dimness as if unsure she was still alive. Then the eldest, Nayeli, pushed herself upright. Her voice was hoarse. "You kept us alive." Caleb didn't answer. He poured the last of his coffee into a tin cup, handed it to her, and said flatly, "Alive's a word the desert doesn't care much about." The women exchanged glances, nervous, guarded. Lozen, the tall one with the sharp eyes, stood between them and the door, half ready to run. Ahioka, the one with a bandaged shoulder, trembled when Caleb moved too close. Sani huddled near the stove, holding a chunk of bread as if it might vanish. Caleb turned his back to them, rummaging for more wood. He could feel their fear pressing against his spine, heavier than the air itself. He wanted to say something that would ease it, but words had never been his trade. When he stepped outside, the wind slapped his face with cold grit. No hoofprints, no smoke on the horizon. Whoever had been hunting them hadn't reached this far yet. He stood there for a long time, staring at the endless plain, then muttered, "Damn fool," and went back inside. Nayeli was standing now, straight-backed, despite her exhaustion. "If you want us gone," she said quietly, "we'll go, but we'll die out there." Caleb looked at her, really looked this time. The cracked lips, the bruises, the thin arms still holding on to pride. He exhaled, slow and bitter. "Then you stay. For now." 5 pairs of eyes lifted toward him. None of them smiled. But for the first time, they didn't look afraid. By nightfall, the wind had died. The cabin stood quiet, its corners breathing smoke and dust. Caleb fed the stove until the metal glowed red. 5 pairs of eyes followed every motion, cautious, measuring the distance between his mercy and his temper. He ladled soup into tin bowls, set them on the table without a word. The women hesitated. Hunger trembled through them like fever. Finally, the youngest Sanny reached out first, whispering, "Thank you." Her voice was so small it almost vanished under the crackle of the fire. They ate in silence. Every bite sounded loud in the stillness, every spoon scraping the tin a reminder of how near death had been. Caleb didn't sit. He leaned against the wall, watching them with the same wary patience he used with wild horses. When the food was gone, Nayeli rose and gathered the empty bowls. Her hand shook, but her eyes met his without flinching. "You didn't have to help us," she said. Caleb's answer came low, almost a growl. "No one helped me either. Guess that makes us even." The words hung between them, rough, but not cruel. Outside, the desert moaned through the cracks, carrying the scent of ash and faraway rain. Ahioka shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Lozen sat near the door, knife hidden beneath her skirt, still guarding what little trust they had. Caleb knelt by the fire, added one more log. "Get some sleep," he muttered. "Tomorrow, we'll see about fixing the well." One by one, they lay down by the warmth, too tired to speak, too broken to dream. Sandy murmured something in Apache, a prayer, soft as breath. Caleb didn't understand the words, but he caught the rhythm of it. Thanks, sorrow, and something like hope. He sat there long after they'd fallen asleep, staring at the flames licking the iron stove. It had been years since anyone else had breathed under his roof. Now, 5 strangers did, and the silence of his life had finally cracked. The morning came sharp and brittle. Frost crusted the fence posts, and the desert stretched endless and white under the pale Sunday. Caleb was already outside when the first sound reached him, a low echo of hooves carried by wind. He froze. It wasn't close, but it was their men riding. Maybe 2, maybe more. He crouched low near the corral, running his calloused fingers across the dirt. Fresh tracks. Not his. Inside the cabin, the women stirred as the door swung open. Caleb's voice cut through the cold like steel. "Stay low. Don't go near the window." Nayeli's face went pale. Lozen stood instantly, reaching for the small knife she had hidden beneath her blanket. "They found us?" "Not yet," Caleb said. "But they're looking." He moved to the shelf, loading cartridges into his rifle with steady, deliberate clicks. The sound made Ahioka flinch. Sani covered her ears. Caleb noticed, hesitated for a moment, then set the rifle down beside the door. "I'm not looking for trouble," he muttered. "But if it comes, I'll meet it." Outside, the hooves faded, turning north, away from the ridge. But he knew better than to believe they were gone. Men like that didn't just ride past. They circled, they waited. He stepped back in, brushing dust off his coat. Nayeli stood by the window, peering through the cracks. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "What I have to." She studied him, the scar on his temple catching the firelight. "You risk your life for strangers?" He met her eyes steady, unblinking. "You stop being strangers when someone's hunting you." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling through the boards. Then Lozen crossed the floor, pulling the latch on the door tight. "If they come, we fight," she said simply. Caleb nodded once. It wasn't a promise of victory, just survival. And in the desert, that was enough. As the sun sank behind the ridge, shadows stretched long across the dust. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. Rifles rested by the wall, and 6 hearts beat to the same rhythm: fear, defiance, and something dangerously close to faith. By noon, the wind had died. The silence felt wrong, too still, too clean. Even the ravens were gone from the ridge. Caleb Morton stood at the fence line, hand resting on the barrel of his rifle. The air smelled of iron and dust, the kind that always came before men. He didn't have to wait long. A thin line of riders appeared on the horizon, sun flashing off metal. 5 of them, maybe 6. He cursed softly, low in his throat. Inside the cabin, Nayeli saw his face and knew. "They're back," she whispered. Lozen grabbed her knife, eyes burning. "If they take us again, I'll die fighting." Caleb turned, voice calm but hard as rock. "You won't die here." He limped toward the door, his bad leg dragging through the sand. He'd fought before soldiers, raiders, drifters, but never with 5 women behind him depending on whether he breathed another minute. The riders slowed as they reached the yard. The man in front, red scarf, Silvertooth, grinned. Well, thought we smelled smoke. You seen 5 Apache girls come this way, old man?" Caleb didn't blink. "Ain't seen anyone worth findin'." The leader laughed, spitting tobacco into the dust. "You sure? Word says they're worth more than a good horse in Silver Basin. You're sitting on gold, old man, if you got 'em." Caleb leveled the rifle, the sound of the bolt clicking echoing like thunder in the still air. "You take 1 step closer, you'll find out what I'm sitting on." The man's grin faltered. The others shifted in their saddles. No one moved. Inside, Ahioka clutched Sani to her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. Lozen crouched near the window, ready to strike with nothing but a kitchen knife. The cabin walls seemed to breathe with their fear. Caleb's heart pounded steady, not with panic, but with memory. He'd lost too many before. He wasn't losing them too. Finally, the man sneered and tugged the reins. "This ain't done," he said. "You can't keep what don't belong to you." Caleb's voice was calm, cold. "Then come take it." The men hesitated. The desert stretched wide and empty behind them, no cover, no wind. And in that silence, something about the old scout's stance made them think twice. One by one, they turned their horses and rode off, their laughter dying slow in the distance. When the last echo vanished, Caleb lowered the rifle, but his hands still trembled. He turned toward the cabin, pushing the door open. They were all standing motionless, waiting. Nayeli's face was pale, her lips pressed tight. "You should have let them take us," she said softly. "They'll come back. They'll bring more." Caleb's gaze burned. "Then they'll find more waiting for them." He set the rifle against the wall, breathing heavy. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sani stepped forward barefoot, trembling, and poured a tin cup of water, setting it beside him. "You saved us," she whispered. Caleb looked at her, at all of them, hollow eyes, scarred hands, but alive. "I didn't save anyone," he said. "I just didn't let good people die thirsty." Nayeli's voice broke the silence. "Then we help. We work. We stay." Caleb studied her face, pride, pain, and something like courage. He nodded once. "Then we built." Outside, the sun sank behind the canyon, painting the sand red. Inside, the fire glowed brighter than before. And for the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. The next morning broke golden and cold. Dew clung to the splintered fence rails, and the sky above New Mexico burned with that pale blue that only came after fear. The night before still lived in their bones, every echo of hoofbeats, every breath they'd held in the dark. But the riders hadn't returned. Not yet. Caleb Morton stepped out with his rifle slung across his back, and the ache in his bad leg dragging behind him. The air smelled of dust and pine smoke. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone walking into the morning. The women followed one by one, wrapped in Caleb's old blankets and patched coats. Nayeli carried a bucket. Lozen had his hammer. Ahioka, thin and quiet, walked barefoot despite the cold. The youngest, Sani and Tiva, stumbled after them, eyes half-lidded from hunger but still curious at every sound. Caleb stopped at the broken fence line. "If you want to stay," he said, voice rough but even, "we work. Ain't charity here. Not for me. Not for you." Nayeli nodded. "We understand." He handed her a shovel, then turned toward the corral. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Lozen stepped forward first, her dark hair catching the wind. She dropped to her knees beside him, pushing dirt away with both hands. The others followed. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, sweat mixed with dust on their skin, streaking through bruises that hadn't yet faded. The rhythm of work became language, the thud of hammer, scrape of shovel, splash of water from the barrel. Caleb said little. He watched how they moved, how Lozen's strength balanced Nayeli's patience, how Ahioka sang under her breath to keep the younger girls from crying, how Sani smiled when a fence post finally stood upright. It was strange, hearing laughter again. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed it until it echoed against the canyon walls. By noon, they stopped to rest in the thin shade of the cabin. Nayeli passed him a cup of water, her hand steady now. "You built all this alone?" she asked. Caleb took the cup, his gaze on the horizon. "Tried to, but the land don't like men alone." He took a long drink, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "My wife used to say a place only breathes if someone else shares the air." Lozen looked at him, her expression softer than before. "Then maybe this place is breathing again." The words hung there fragile, unexpected. Caleb didn't answer. But when he looked at the half-finished fence, at their blistered hands, he felt something he hadn't in years. The weight of purpose. That afternoon, they repaired the well. The rope creaked, the bucket groaned, and when the first gush of clear water spilled into the trough, Sani squealed with joy. The sound was pure, sharp as sunlight. Caleb smiled small, almost invisible, but real. When the day faded, the six of them sat by the fire outside, the sky stretching wide and silver. Smoke curled into the wind. The desert, once cruel, now hummed with quiet peace. Ahioka braided Sani's hair. Lozen carved a small bone charm with her knife. Nayeli sat beside Caleb, her voice low. "You think they'll come back?" He stared into the fire. "Men like that don't forget, but they bleed like anyone else." She nodded. "Then we'll be ready." For a long while, they said nothing more. Only the sound of the flames and the rustle of the wind through the dry grass. Then, softly, Sani began to hum an Apache lullaby, faint and trembling. One by one, the others joined in. Caleb didn't know the words, but he felt them. The song wasn't about war or loss. It was about endurance, about surviving long enough to see another sunrise. When the fire dimmed, he looked up at the vast sky above them, a sky that belonged to no man. 5 women sat under it, alive because he hadn't turned them away. And for the first time since his wife's death, Caleb Morton whispered a prayer, not for peace, but for strength to protect what little life had found its way back to him. For 3 days, the world seemed merciful. No riders, no smoke, no sound but wind and hammering. Caleb fixed the roof, while Lozen patched the cracks in the window frames. Nayeli gathered herbs by the creek, her hands sure and gentle despite the scars. Ahioka sang while she cooked beans in the pot, her soft humming filling the cabin with something it hadn't known in years' life. Every morning began the same way. Silence, then work, then laughter. Sani and Tiva argued over who could carry more water. Caleb watched from the porch, the ache in his chest no longer from grief, but from something more dangerous: warmth. He had lived years believing the world had ended the day his wife died. But now, with these 5 women in his yard, repairing what was once broken, he began to wonder if the end had only been a pause. That afternoon, the wind carried the smell of rain, rare and holy in the desert. Dark clouds gathered over the ridge, and thunder rolled far away like the growl of an old god. Caleb stood by the fence, his hand resting on the wood, watching the horizon. Nayeli joined him, her hair braided back, her face calm. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He nodded. "It's warning us." She smiled faintly. "Maybe both." For a while, they stood side by side, neither speaking. The air between them thickened, full of things unspoken. When she turned toward him, her eyes caught the faint glow of lightning, and for a heartbeat, he saw everything she'd endured: the hunger, the fear, the quiet courage that had carried her through it. He wanted to reach out, but didn't. Some boundaries couldn't be crossed, not yet. Inside, Ahioka and Lozen were mending blankets near the fire. The younger girls giggled as they tried to patch Caleb's torn shirt. The cabin smelled of bread and wood smoke. It was small, crowded, but alive like a heartbeat in the middle of nowhere. When night fell, the rain came sudden and hard. They rushed to close the shutters, laughter rising over the storm. Water leaked through the roof, splashing into the tin bucket by the door. Roof's still leaking, Caleb muttered. Lozen grinned. Then it's honest like its owner. For the first time, he laughed. A low, rusty sound, almost forgotten. The women froze in surprise, then smiled. It felt like permission to belong. Later, when the rain softened, they sat near the stove, sharing cornbread and stories. Sani asked him, "You always live alone?" Caleb stared into the fire. "After she died, I didn't see reason not to." Nayeli's voice came gentle. "And now?" He hesitated, then answered, "Now I ain't sure." The fire crackled, thunder rolled farther away. Ahioka dozed by the wall. The younger girls curled together under one blanket. Lozen kept watch by the window, knife resting across her thigh. And Nayeli, she sat nearest him, her eyes half closed, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved us, Caleb Morton, but you also saved yourself." He didn't reply, but his chest tightened. Outside, lightning flashed across the sky, and in that white burst, he saw movement along the ridge. Shadows. Riders. He rose instantly, the warmth of the room gone cold. "Get down," he said, voice hard again. Lozen moved first, pulling the curtain shut. The laughter died, replaced by the same heavy silence they'd lived through before. Nayeli looked at him, eyes sharp. "How many?" "Can't tell," he said. "But they've found the trail." The storm outside raged, drowning the sound of distant hooves, but not the dread in their chests. Caleb loaded the rifle, his hand steady, his mind already building walls of resolve. Tomorrow would not be peace. Tomorrow, the desert would test who they truly were. He glanced once at Nayeli, who met his gaze without fear. Between them, the storm cracked open the sky and something stronger than fear began to rise. The storm hadn't ended, it had only learned to whisper. By dawn, the rain was gone, but the clouds hung low and bruised, as if the sky itself had been wounded. Caleb Morton stood at the porch, rifle across his chest, eyes fixed on the ridge where the riders had been. The desert was quiet, too quiet. He knew what that meant. They were close. Inside, Nayeli and Lozen were tying strips of cloth into bandages. Ahioka tended the fire, her hands trembling but steady. The youngest two, Sani and Tiva, crouched near the table, stacking ammunition the way Caleb had shown them hours ago. He'd taught them fast. He had no choice. When the first sound came, the distant rumble of hooves, Nayeli's eyes lifted to meet his. No words, no fear, just readiness. "Stay inside," he said, voice rough. "If I fall, you bar the door." Lozen's reply came sharp. "If you fall, we fight." Before he could argue, the sound grew louder, closer, until 6 shapes emerged from the ridge, cutting through the morning mist. The leader rode front, red scarf flapping, rifle in hand. "Old man," he shouted, "you had your warning." Caleb stepped off the porch, mud sucking at his boots. He raised the rifle and called back, "You had yours." The first shot cracked the silence open. The bullet tore through the fence post inches from his head. He dropped to one knee and fired back one clean, perfect shot. The rider fell hard, his horse bolting into the stormlight. Inside the cabin, the girls flinched, but didn't scream. Lozen ran to the window, firing through the small crack between boards. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but the shot struck true. Another man fell. The air filled with gunfire, wood splintering, smoke rising. Caleb shouted, "Stay low," as he reloaded. His leg burned, his lungs clawed for air, but he didn't stop. He'd been trained for worse, but never for this, not for fighting to protect life instead of taking it. A bullet shattered the cabin window. Sani screamed as glass sliced her arm. Ahioka dragged her to the floor, pressing cloth to the wound, whispering in Apache, voice trembling but calm. Outside, Caleb shifted position, crouching behind the water trough. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. One man tried to circle behind the barn. Caleb saw the movement, took aim, fired. The echo rolled across the valley like thunder. Then silence. For a moment, all he heard was the rain dripping from the roof and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He stood, limping toward the porch, scanning the ridge. 2 horses still stood, riderless. The others had fled, He waited, finger on the trigger, but the sound of retreat was real. They were gone. When he finally lowered the rifle, his hands were shaking. Nayeli stepped out of the cabin, face pale but proud. "You did it," she said quietly. Caleb shook his head. "We did." Lozen followed her out, blood smeared on her arm, eyes sharp as flint. "They'll come back with more." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then we'll build higher walls." He turned toward the cabin. The smell of smoke and fear still lingered. But inside, the girls were alive. Ahioka smiled faintly, holding Sani's hand. Tiva was sweeping glass from the floor. They were still standing. And so was he. When night fell, the desert was silent again. The ridge glowed faint red beneath the dying sun, the blood of the horizon. Caleb sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. The 5 women huddled near the doorway behind him. The world had tried to take them, and failed. He looked at them, their faces lit by the firelight, weary but unbroken, and felt something shift deep in his chest. It wasn't victory. It was belonging. For the first time in years, Caleb Morton wasn't just surviving. He was protecting something worth dying for. The wind changed by dawn. It carried no scent of gunpowder, no echo of hooves, only the stillness that follows when death has already had its share. Caleb Morton stepped out into the yard, the sky bleeding pale gold over the ridge. The earth was torn, trampled, dark with the stains of battle. 2 bodies lay by the fence, half covered in dust and rain. He moved with a limp, shovel in hand, each step heavy but steady. When the girls came out, none of them spoke. They watched in silence as he dug, the sound of metal biting earth louder than the morning birds. Nayeli knelt beside him, pushing dirt with her hands. Lozen joined her next, wordless. Soon all 5 worked beside him, not from duty, but from something deeper, the need to bury the past that had hunted them. When the graves were done, Caleb stood straight, wiping sweat from his brow. Nayeli whispered a few words in Apache, something old, something that sounded like forgiveness. The desert wind carried it away gently. Inside the cabin, the air still smelled of smoke. Ahioka wrapped Sani's wounded arm with fresh bandages. Tiva stirred the pot on the stove, quiet, eyes red from tears. Caleb sat near the fire, the rifle leaning against his chair, hands trembling slightly not from fear, but from exhaustion that reached bone deep. Nayeli came to him, holding a tin cup of water. "You should rest," she said softly. He looked at her, eyes dull with fatigue. "Rest comes when the land's quiet," he said. "Ain't sure it ever really is." She crouched beside him, studying the deep scar along his temple, a wound long before theirs. "Your wife?" she said. "You still carry her." Caleb's jaw worked. "Don't know how not to." Nayeli nodded slowly. "I carried my husband too," she said, "until I learned I was still alive." Her words hung there, simple, steady like truth spoken by someone who had already faced the worst. Caleb met her eyes. "I don't know what to do with the living anymore," he admitted. Nayeli smiled faintly. "You just keep them warm." Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind that comes when pain has been spoken out loud and loses some of its power. Outside, Lozen was fixing the last board on the fence. Ahioka hummed softly while washing the blood from the floor. Sani and Tiva laughed weakly at the sound of a coyote howling far-off, laughter that sounded like defiance. When the sun finally climbed high, Caleb stepped out onto the porch. The land stretched wide before him, endless and alive. The graves behind him glowed red in the light, the kind of red that makes even sorrow look clean. Nayeli joined him, a shawl draped over her shoulders. "They'll come again," she said quietly. He nodded. "Maybe, but they'll find something different here next time." "What?" she asked. Caleb looked out across the plain. "People who ain't running anymore." She turned toward him, searching his face, the man who had once lived only to survive now, standing like a wall between them and the world. And for the first time, she smiled without fear. That night, they didn't light the stove for warmth, they lit it for comfort. The cabin walls still bore scars, but the silence was no longer hollow. Caleb repaired the roof while the girls cooked, laughter spilling like sunlight into every corner. When he sat down, exhausted, Nayeli placed a bowl in front of him. Steam rose from the soup, and he realized it was the first real meal they'd shared since the storm began. He took a bite, slow and deliberate. "Not bad," he said. Lozen grinned. "Better than dying." Laughter rippled through the room. Outside, the desert wind softened, carrying the scent of rain and cedar. Caleb leaned back, eyes on the flickering fire. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought was clear. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting to die. Morning light spilled through the cracks in the roof, warm and gold. It touched each of them where they sat, quiet and alive. And for one fragile moment, the world felt safe again. The next morning smelled of rain. Not the hard, angry kind that tore roofs apart. This was gentler, a whisper of clouds gathering somewhere beyond the ridge. The desert, for once, felt alive. Caleb Morton stood by the corral, watching Sonny and Tiva chase a stubborn goat across the yard. Their laughter rolled through the cold air, startling the birds from the cottonwoods. He hadn't heard that kind of sound in years, laughter that didn't ask permission. Nayeli came up beside him, a shawl around her shoulders. Her hair shimmered with the pale light of dawn. For a while, they just watched the girls, silent. "You ever think the land forgives?" she asked. Caleb took his time answering. "No, the land remembers. But it lets you keep trying." She smiled softly. "Then, maybe that's forgiveness." He looked at her, really looked, and saw how the sun caught the small scars along her neck, the quiet strength in the way she stood. "Storm didn't take you," he said. "Nor you," she replied. The breeze shifted, bringing the smell of wet soil and smoke from the fire where a Hioka cooked breakfast. Lozen was patching Caleb's coat again, humming under her breath. For the first time, the cabin looked lived and not haunted. Nayeli turned toward him. "What will you do now?" Caleb shrugged, staring out at the wide plain. "Keep the fences strong. Keep you fed. Maybe teach these young ones to shoot straight." Her eyes softened. "And after that?" He hesitated. "After that, I'll wait for rain." Nayeli tilted her head, curious. "Why?" "Because rain means there's still a reason to plant." For a moment, silence fell again, the kind that didn't hurt anymore. Then she reached out, her hand brushing his. The touch was simple, but it felt like a vow. "We'll plant together then," she said. Caleb's throat tightened. "Yeah, we will." Behind them, Sonny's laughter rang out again. The sky above began to darken, not with storm, but with promise. The first drops fell, soft against the dust, turning the earth darker, richer. Caleb tilted his head back, feeling the rain touch his face. Beside him, Nayeli did the same, eyes closed, lips curved in peace. The cabin behind them glowed with firelight, the smell of beans and fresh bread spilling into the air. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Because under that quiet rain, two souls that had once begged for survival finally began to live. Spring came slow to the desert. The frost melted first from the fence posts, then from the well's rim, until finally, water shimmered like glass under the Sunday. For the first time in years, Caleb Morton woke to the sound of voices, not ghosts, but laughter. Nayeli was already outside, tending to the small patch of corn they'd planted by the creek. Her sleeves were rolled up, hair tied back with a strip of cloth. Lozen and Ahioka worked beside her, turning the soil, while Sanny and Tiva chased a chicken that refused to be caught. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. The roof was mended, the walls straight, the smoke from the stove curling lazy and blue against the morning sky. Life had returned, quiet, steady, and stubborn. Caleb leaned against the porch post, coffee in hand, his limp barely noticeable now. He had spent years surviving this land alone, thinking loneliness was the price of peace. But watching them move through the sunlight, hearing them call to one another in a blend of English and Apache, he realized peace had never meant silence. When Nayeli noticed him watching, she smiled, the kind of smile that carried both strength and forgiveness. "Fence needs fixing again," she teased. He smirked. "You break it, you fix it." She laughed, and the sound carried across the yard like wind through grass. By noon, they all worked together, rebuilding the barn wall that the storm had torn apart weeks ago. Nails, wood, and laughter filled the air. When Tiva dropped a board on her foot, Sanny burst into giggles until Caleb tossed her a rag and said, "If you can laugh, you can work." When the last plank was nailed in, they stood together, dusty, sweating, alive. Lozen lifted her chin. Looks better than before. Caleb nodded. So do we. Evening fell soft and golden. They gathered by the fire as the wind cooled, passing bread and beans between calloused hands. Ahioko played a tune on a small flute she'd carved, the melody thin but full of warmth. Naili sat close beside Caleb. You ever think you'd live this long? She asked. He shook his head. Didn't think I'd live this way. The firelight flickered across their faces, survivors who had turned ruin into refuge. When the stars rose, the desert seemed endless again, but not empty. It was their land now patched together by courage, fed by hope, guarded by the ghosts of what they had overcome. Caleb reached for Nayeli's hand. She didn't pull away. Guess we built something after all, he murmured. Nayeli's eyes glimmered. Not a house, she said softly. A home. And in that vast silence of the frontier, under a sky wide enough to forgive every past sin, 6 hearts beat steady together, alive, and finally free. In a land that forgot mercy, they built their own. Caleb Morton, once a man buried in silence, found his voice again in the laughter of 5 Apache women who refused to die. Together, they turned a broken cabin into a home, and their scars into something stronger than memory, belonging. The desert still whispered of danger, but under that same sky, they had already won by choosing to stay, to build, to love. Because sometimes redemption isn't found in prayer or gunfire. It's found in the quiet act of keeping each other alive. Subscribe for more Wild West love stories.